Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we respond to viewers' questions on everything from political philosophy to popular culture.
Right. And Laurel wants to know, were the Dark Ages, and by that she means 580 to 1000 AD, were they really all that bad?
That's a wonderful question, and an opportunity for me to get myself in even more trouble. It's bad enough defending the Middle Ages, which a lot of people don't know from the Dark Ages, and some people actually do say, no, the Middle Ages actually extend all the way from the fall of Rome to the coming of the Renaissance. But making Laurel's division, people might concede that there's some virtue to the Middle Age, but the Dark Ages, oh man, that was the end. And the Dark Ages certainly get off to a bad start. Rome collapses politically and militarily, and the barbarians come pouring in, and they do a lot of the sort of damage that means we still know the name of the Vandals, many centuries after the last actual Vandal with a capital V left the face of the earth. But in point of fact, no, the Dark Ages were not that bad. They were not that bad for several reasons. To begin with, they were filled with human beings, which means they were, in many respects, both as good and as bad as any other epoch in history. But also, and I'm thinking here particularly of the British Isles, which I know best, and which in many ways are best defended, a lot went right in the Middle Ages. To begin with, a good deal of Roman Britain was preserved, at least for a while. You get this legendary figure of King Arthur, but there's a kernel of historical truth in some sort of Briton chieftain who helped hold back the Saxons by winning this great victory at Baden Hill. And we went to a place that may well have been where his court was, and they had pottery from the Eastern Mediterranean. There was still trade. There was still an effort to preserve learning. There was still fluency in Latin. When the Saxons take over, again, it looks like everybody's going to die, and they do seem to have, in fact, killed a very large number of people. Nobody's quite sure if they just won a few battles against the Britons or basically exterminated them if they didn't flee to Wales. Probably somewhere in between. And the Saxons show up, and they do seem like, the Vandals and the Visigoths and that crowd. But very quickly, a number of things happen to them. First of all, they do seem to take a look at the Roman Britain civilization and say, hey, you know what, there's something here. There's something we couldn't do that's worthy of admiration, not merely of being trashed and then we'll dance around in the rubble and get thoroughly drunk. And then they're evangelized, beginning with Ethelbert of Kent in the very late 6th century. So that's how quickly it happens. And Britain is, or England, I should call it by now, of course, after the Angles, is converted to Christianity. And with this, they are converted to some sense that there is more to life than plunder and pillage and inebriation. Not that wine doesn't have its place in their lives, but they start trying to build. You get this Archbishop of Canterbury in the 7th century who comes from Tarsus in Asia Minor, and he brings with him stonemasons and glaziers to teach the English these crafts to move from timber into stone, and you start to get better stone buildings. You get the Venerable Bede writing his history in Latin, and then in the 9th century you get Alfred the Great, who with one hand is holding off the next wave of terrible pagans with their awful gods and their blood-stained weapons, and with the other he's teaching himself Latin as an adult so that he can translate things like Bede into Anglo-Saxon for the benefit of his people. And you get into the 10th century, and again, I do apologize, to France and Spain because I'm talking much less about them because I know much less about them. But in Britain, in the 10th century, you get kings like Athelstan the Magnificent. Edgar the Peaceful famously rode on the River Dee by 8 kings to symbolize his overlordships. You get political unity, you get a reasonable degree of peace, you get a reasonable degree of plenty. Okay, they weren't all typing on their iPhones, but things were going pretty well. And elsewhere, you get Charlemagne's magnificent cathedral in Aachen. You have trouble, the Islamic invasion through Spain into France, which is then repelled. The hero Charles Martel, you have heroes in those days. There are constant raids on southern Italy, but there's also a functioning papacy. There is a flourishing of the arts. And in many ways, the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages have their reputation blackened by self-consciously modern people who say, well, there was this sort of light of learning and civility in the ancient world in Greece and Rome, and then there was this long, hideous period of barbarian invasions, and worse than that, Christian faith. But then the lights came back on in the 15th and 16th century. We started to make man the measure of all things again. Do what thou wilt became our motto, and after that everything was great. But it's curious. The British Foreign Secretary, when we had the war in Yugoslavia with Slobodan Milosevic, and he was complaining about the concentration camps, and these things belong in the Middle Ages. They don't belong in the 20th century. What are you, mental? The Middle Ages didn't invent the concentration camp. They invented the hospital, and the university, and also the chimney. Not a bad thing to have. The Dark Ages, they invented hay, so you could keep your cattle in over winter and not have to slaughter them. All kinds of things went well. In the 20th century is the one where we got Hitler and we got Stalin. And the 21st century is not without its discontents as well. So yeah, the Dark Ages had their dark moments, as all periods in human history do. And some of them are the ones people think existed, like the barbarian invasions. But they also had a lot of morality, of learning, of striving for better things in a way that not only commands our admiration that they did this under difficult circumstances, but that in some cases created a period of time in which we would have been very happy to live. So there's my view of the Dark Ages. Not so dark. And the Middle Ages, not so middle. Being self-consciously modern can be a real problem in understanding the past, as well as sometimes an advantage.
All right, so the problem is us then.
In large measure, the problem is us. And yes, if you brought back Athelstan the Magnificent or Edmund the Deed-Doer and showed him modern civilization, he would be rightly appalled by a great deal of it. And if we can't figure out what it is, it's not because we're smarter than they were.
All right, thanks for that, folks. If you want to play along and ask your question of the professor, the URL on your screen will explain everything. Thanks, and see you next time.